Okay, so yesterday we got through the First Continental Congress, okay, and started the Second Continental Congress after the battles of Lexington and Concord, okay. And if you haven't watched that lecture yet, Sam Adams and John Hancock were two leaders of the Sons of Liberty. And when the British went out there to Lexington and Concord, they were looking for those two men. They were wanted for treason. Okay, this is a great, friendship of very different people, and it's really interesting how it all worked out. Okay, so with the Second Continental Congress, that is going to basically be our government. These delegates that show up from the 13 colonies, from May 75 to March 71, they're going to be in Philadelphia. Now, they'll go home from time to time. And guys, during this whole time, the American Revolution is taking place. So there are times where the British get really close to Philadelphia. And so they're going to have to flee, okay, when the British get close. Because they're wanted for treason. All of these men that are in the Continental Congress, all right? In 1791, they will write the first constitution called the Articles of Confederation, all right? The war ends in 1783, okay? So this is what's holding the colonies together during, independence. Now, as far as the Declaration goes, there was a lot of debate over this, okay? And this is, an artist's rendering of the Independence Hall and the men that were in that room. Now, you know some of the names, okay? Obviously, this is Thomas Jefferson right here, okay, who writes the document, okay? So by June of 1776, nearly all the delegates agreed that we should declare independence, okay? So shortly after Lexington and Concord, you get the Battle of Bunker Hill. Remember learning about that? You guys, really the argument here is that American blood, Massachusetts blood, Virginia blood is shed by the British, and we need to respond to that, okay? And really the loudest voice in the room for independence is this guy, John Adams, okay, who originally didn't want independence for Britain, okay? He was somebody that would have to be brought along, okay? But once the Intolerable Acts happened, he was like, you know what? The heck with the British, all right? Now, there were men in the room that disagreed. There was a lot of fighting over this because when Jefferson wrote the Declaration, he, obviously was a slaveholder, okay? And he put some clauses in there really talking about ending slavery. So the southern colonies, like South Carolina, North Carolina, these colonies were like, we're not joining, okay? But what they needed was 9 of the 13 to declare independence, okay? 9 of the 13 colonies. That's what the rules were that they set up, okay? And John Hancock is going to be the president. Okay, now he hates the British. They've been, seizing his ships and all kinds of stuff, destroying his commerce. Okay, but he's going to be the president of the Second Continental Congress. It is Hancock that says, you know what? If we only get 9, we're going to be off to a bad start because we're going to have 4 colonies that don't want to break away from the British, and we're going to be a house divided at the beginning. And so it's Hancock that proposes, no, we need all 13 to say yes to independence. This is huge because this brings everybody together, okay? And between, these men and many others that I don't have, listed, they're going to decide, Jefferson's going to write it, okay? And then there's going to be others that help him edit it, okay? This is July 4th, okay? So the committee to write the Declaration includes John Adams, Ben Franklin, of course, Thomas Jefferson, who penned it, Robert Livingston, and Roger Sherman. Okay. So once Jefferson writes it, they're going to start to edit it. So like they had arguments over all different parts of this. And so the original that Jefferson wrote was stripped of certain things. Changes were made to it. Okay. John Adams is a brilliant man. Thomas Jefferson's a brilliant man. Ben Franklin's a unique man. Okay. Ben Franklin was an inventor, so was Jefferson. These guys made up all kinds of different inventions during their lifetime. So like this chair. See how this chair spins like this? Jefferson made a chair that did like this, that would turn. Okay? And how he used that is, you know, when you guys pull a shade, there's like a pulley. Okay? He used the idea from that to use, you know, like pulleys on the bottom of the chair, two people play, you know, and it would spin. Okay. So, I mean, these guys, they're really brilliant. So they're going to change like the wording. So when they used inalienable rights, you know how John Locke used natural rights? Instead, they used inalienable rights. And then they argued over the spelling of the word. Okay. So once they stripped it and fixed it and so forth, Jefferson had to rewrite it to the way everybody agreed. Okay. And that was done on July 2nd. On July 4th, they signed it. Okay. They were all committing treason by putting their name on that document. And Franklin said at the time, he said, we most assuredly must hang together, or we will all hang separately. Okay. It was, I mean, these are wealthy men. They are risking everything. The British want their heads. Okay. So this document lays out what we talked about with John Locke, the rights of man. Okay. And how that people have the right to govern themselves, not to be governed by somebody. Okay. And so this is kind of, it's enlightenment of liberty. And so it really plays an important role in history, okay? And just getting to talk a little bit about it, I think is great, okay? So protections of basic rights and liberties rely on the consent of the governed for authority. Now, they're going to need, if they're declaring independence, and we're already at war, we need a commander-in-chief. We need an army. And so there was one guy that showed up at the Constitutional Convention from Virginia every day in his military uniform. He was the only one that showed up in a military uniform every day. And that, of course, was George Washington. He was 6'4", okay, in a time when the average height of an American male was about 5'7", 5'8". Okay, so he stood out. He walked in the room. Now, Washington doesn't have a sterling military career. Okay, he's had a lot of defeats in his military career. Okay, but he wants the job. Hancock wants the job too. Hancock wants to be the commander-in-chief, but they choose Washington. Okay, and they're going to create the Continental Army. Now, guys, they're making this crap up as they go along. Continental Army. Somebody had to come up with that name. And who came up with the name, the United States of America? Okay, because they're going to have to make all this stuff up. They didn't even know what they were going to call the president. Okay, so this is like starting from scratch. This is the first time this has ever been done in history. Okay, and so this is the unique founding of our country. All right, so they signed the Declaration. Now, all of a sudden, okay, Washington was named commander-in-chief actually on June 15th, 1776. Okay, he's got about 20,000 men. Now, I'm kind of going outside. I'm just talking American Revolution stuff here. He's got about 20,000 men, all right? Now, these people that enlisted in the Continental Army, of course, many of them had fought in militias and so forth, but they have very short enlistments. So, like, if you join the military out of high school, what's the minimum amount of time you have to serve if you sign up? 4, 2 to 4. I'm not sure. But even at 2, these guys have like 6-month enlistments because they got to go back home for the harvest. Okay, there's going to, they've planted their crops, they're going to go fight the British, and then they got to go home to farm. They got to feed their families. Okay? And so Washington's army, they go immediately up to Massachusetts. Okay, and by, of course, the British have occupied Boston. All right. One of Washington's generals, a guy named General Knox, and this is a great story. Okay, General Knox, he's a big fat guy. Okay, he takes a couple thousand men up to Canada to Fort Ticonderoga. It's a British fort, and they take the fort and steal all the cannon up in Canada. And they bring the cannon back to Boston. Okay, they're like having to pull these with oxen and horses and come across rivers and lakes, building like shed and over mountains to bring these cannon back. Okay, so once Knox got back to Boston, under the cover of darkness, there's what's called the Dorchester Heights, which goes around the outside of Boston. It kind of rims Boston, so you can look down on the city. And over the cover of darkness, Knox put all these cannon around Boston. Okay, and when the British woke up the next morning, they were surrounded. Those cannon could have destroyed their navy sitting in Boston Harbor. So when they saw those cannon, the British packed up and left. They went to New York. Okay, now guys, we're very thankful because the British could have burned Boston while they were leaving. You know what I mean? They could have like torched it. Thankfully they didn't. So all that history is still there. Okay. So when they went up to New York, took the Navy, New York has one of the world's best ports. That's why New York was so big, because of the ports. And so Washington takes his army, 10,000, splits them. They're in Manhattan, okay, Brooklyn. And then the British come in with a bunch of soldiers, and tactically it was bad. So Washington showed basically his rule during the American Revolution was never give up the army. So if there was ever a chance where the British army could destroy his army, he would run. Okay, never engage if you got a chance of losing the army. Okay, so what did Washington do? Took them all the way up to New York, and then they fled. By this time, winter's setting in. So the Americans go down to Valley Forge, Pennsylvania. Okay, and the British, because they're fair weather fighters, they're going to stay put in New York, and they're going to send some German Hessians down to kind of keep the Americans down in Pennsylvania. Okay, down in New Jersey, Trenton. Okay. And then in Christmas Day, you remember the story of Washington crossing the Delaware. Okay, that was Christmas Day, 1776. The war's going to last 8 more years. Okay, so it's that, and I can't go through the whole American Revolution, but that's kind of how it's fought. But his army went from 20,000 to 2,000 in the span of 6 months. Okay, and they're freezing their butts off in Pennsylvania. Okay, they crossed the Delaware River, surprised the German Hessians, and Washington gets his first victory. One of very few victories. Okay, cool. So I love talking about that stuff. So take a little time. Okay, so now 13 colonies have declared independence from Great Britain. What do you have now? You have 13 countries. The only thing holding those countries together is that Continental Congress in Philadelphia. Okay, they have no constitution. So the states, which are countries, basically. Okay, and I don't know if when you guys studied the Civil War, these people would refer to their colonies or their states as their country. John Adams talked about how Massachusetts is my country. Robert E. Lee during the Civil War, remember, he said, Virginia is my country. All right, so there's a different thinking than we have today, as we are a country, the United States, that is our nation, we live in states. Okay, but how much do those states really mean to you and I? You know what I mean? Hey. Okay. So now these 13 countries, they need to write constitutions. They need a governing law. Okay. So although I'm calling them countries, they are, they're state constitutions. Okay. These are important to look at because our first constitution is not going to work, guys. And there are some mistakes made. And so when they write the new constitution that we have today, they're going to use these to learn from. Okay. So they all show a desire for limited government. Okay. All of them had bicameral legislatures, 2 houses, an upper and lower chamber. Okay. And they all gave very little power to their governors. These men fear strong government, strong central government. So most of the power will be held in the legislatures, not with the executive branch, not the governor of the state. And because they were distrustful of power, they held annual elections. Okay? Which is crazy to think about today. I mean, if you look at like our presidential elections, the campaign period lasts more than a year. It's like 16 months that people are campaigning for president. Think if we did that every year. Oh, you couldn't. So you get elected, you start campaigning again. You know what I mean? It's crazy to think doing this every year. But they didn't trust government. They didn't want government to have a lot of power. Okay? Now, today, Pennsylvania has a bicameral legislature. Today, we have 50 states with 50 state constitutions. 49 of the 50 states have bicameral legislatures, meaning they have a House and a Senate. There's only one state, and it's not Pennsylvania, that has a unicameral, one-body legislature. Anybody know which one it is? Which state?
Alaska.
Not Alaska. Come on.
Sounds like a California.
New Mexico.
No.
Utah.
No.
Virginia.
Alabama.
No.
Louisiana.
Kansas.
No.
South
No.
Wisconsin.
No.
Maine.
No.
Rhode
No.
Island.
No.
Columbia.
New Jersey.
No.
New York.
No.
Maine. Hawaii.
No.
Rhode Island.
No.
Texas.
No.
I said Texas.
Nevada.
Now you're repeating
Okay,
yourself.
what
No.
side? What side of the country?
Middle.
Colorado.
Oklahoma.
Nebraska.
Of course.
Nebraska is the only one that has a single house in their state legislature. Okay. Mrs. Lovelace's grandfather served in that body as a state legislature in Nebraska. They're Nebraska people. Okay. All right. So these state constitutions. Yeah. So your dad would know that. Okay. How does this keep turning around? The tags like right up there on the note. Okay. Individual rights. Okay. So this is important for later on. So inside these state constitutions, they had bills of rights, okay? So remember the English constitutions, the Magna Carta, Petition of Right, the English Bill of Rights, these state constitutions had echoed the English Bill of Rights, okay? So no quartering of soldiers, no taxation without representation, these sorts of things, okay? Some of them even expanded voting rights. Because remember, up to this point, everybody we talk about is in the legislature, in many cases, to get to vote, are white male property owners. Okay? But there's a lot of white males that don't own property, but do pay taxes. So 5 of the 13 states actually allowed just white male taxpayers to vote. Now, we got a long way to go here, okay, till we have voting rights for everybody, right? I mean, before women get the right to vote. We got a long way to go, okay? But this does show a little bit of an expansion of voting rights, okay? It's a baby step. Other things that we see in these state constitutions, separation of power between the executive branch, the legislative branch, and judicial branches, and really the idea of self-government. This is key to what we're going to have in the U.S. Constitution, okay? Good? Okay. Brian, you might check out the first 10 minutes of class because it's pretty good, I think.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. All right, so usually I do this as the homework, guys, but I've kind of gotten nicer, and so I give you 29 points instead of, which would be about, 10 points of homework, okay? So let me talk about the Articles of Confederation real quick, okay? Which maybe you can, if you're taking notes, you can just kind of add these in, okay? So Articles of Confederation, remember that was 1781, okay, that they wrote the first Constitution, okay? This is still during the Revolution, okay? So you had 13 states. Now they're going to become one union with the new Articles of Confederation, okay? 13 is now one, okay? Now, the national government is a one branch, one body. That one branch is going to be the legislative branch, okay? There's no executive, and there's no judicial. Just one legislative branch. And each state is going to get to send one person to the legislature. So how many people are there in the United States government under the Articles of Confederation? 13. That's it. One from each state. Okay? How do I have this? I don't know what I have here. Yeah. Okay. So, I don't know if you remember this, but it's good to review it. Remember, the legislative branch controls the purse, yes? The executive has the sword. They get to enforce the law, carry out the law, execute the law, okay? And then the judicial branch, the scales, or, they determine who's right and who's wrong, settle disputes, okay? With no sword and no ability to settle disputes between the states, this is what's really going to go wrong. There's arguments between the states. Now, when you have 13 people, okay, you got 13 people in the legislature, they got to choose somebody to be in charge. You just can't. You got to have somebody in charge. You know what I mean? It's going to be messy. So they choose one of the 13 to be in charge. The first president of the United States. A guy named John Hanson. They choose John Hanson to be the leader of the 13 men. Okay. Now, does he have any real power like a chief executive? No. Okay. But what begins to happen is, I'm gonna go over to a map. Actually, I could just use, I'll go up here, use a map up here. This thing's probably freaking out. Okay, over here. Okay, let me scroll back a few slides, because I do have a map. Yeah, okay. This is the Chesapeake Bay, right here, okay? My wife and I went about 15 years ago. Her boss liked to sail, and so him and his wife and their daughter invited us to go sailing on the Chesapeake for a week. Freaking cool, all right? But anyhow, okay, so you've got Maryland, you got Virginia, okay, and then the rivers that run through here, okay? So if you were Pennsylvania, you're kind of landlocked. Can you use, if you're Pennsylvania, can use the Chesapeake and maybe some rivers to get goods and supplies into Pennsylvania, okay? These more landlocked, okay, like Pennsylvania, they were upset because Maryland and Virginia were charging them to use the Chesapeake. And they were charging them to use rivers that they were using for commerce. They're like, what the heck? What are you doing? And then they had disputes over their borders. Like, no, this is Maryland. No, this is New Jersey. You know what I mean? And so all these fights started happening between the states, and you've got 13 men, and nobody to settle these disputes. So pretty soon you got 6 against 7. And the country starts to tear at each other. Another power that these men didn't have, they could not tax. They couldn't tax the colonies. So how do you raise any money? If they wanted to raise an army, they actually had to beg the states for money. They couldn't tax it. So guys, this article's Confederation. Okay, the war ends in 1783. Okay, by 1787, I mean, we've won the war, but the country's falling apart with infighting. Okay, so the Articles of Confederation, guys, is going to end in failure. Okay, that's a long story short. Okay, the first Constitution is not going to work. Now, the reason they set it up that way is because they feared strong national government, right? They didn't give it any power. Now, it could coin money. It could raise an army, but it had no money to do it with. So, there's a guy named George Washington that has really given up so much for this country already. On the eve of the American Revolution, George Washington told his wife, what's her name? Martha Washington. And he lived at Mount Vernon, okay, which is in Virginia. He's a Virginian. He married into money. Washington did. He married up for sure, okay. Her family was very wealthy. And Mount Vernon is still standing today where he lived, okay. Washington told Martha, I'll be home for Christmas. He showed up for Christmas 8 years later. Okay. He fought in the French and Indian War. He leads the American Revolution. He's had horses shot from underneath him. He's had bullets go through his coat. I mean, this man has survived. Okay. And now all the work that he's put into this country, he's seeing it just disappear before his eyes. The whole thing is starting to crumble. We have so much debt from the American Revolution because we borrowed money from Spain, we borrowed money from the French, it's all falling apart. And Washington's like, we can't let this happen. They're predicting this in Europe because this has never been done before. Nobody's ever broken away and started from scratch a new country like this. And so they're expecting us to fail. We can't let that happen. So Washington is writing letters to anybody that'll listen saying, we need to do something. We need a new constitution. Okay, we need to alter this political creed, he said. Okay. Now there's some new faces on the scene here. Okay, some young guys that are now growing up. Okay. So I'm going to change the names up here. Now John Adams is still around. Sam is still around, but he's going to go on to not do much. He'll serve in the Massachusetts legislature. Hancock will become governor of Massachusetts. Okay. Paul Revere into obscurity. I'm going to add some new names here. James Madison. He's a Virginian. As a child, was very sickly, small, goes about 5'4", okay? Always had fits of discomfort, and he was a bookworm. He was a nerd, okay? He had a tutor that came and stayed in his house with him. That's how he got his education. They had literally doctors come in and educate this young man. By the age of 12, he spoke several different languages. He read all the Enlightenment authors. Was a brilliant young man. And he was spotted by Thomas Jefferson, who's also from Virginia. So we know Jefferson's very important at this point, and Madison is his protege. Okay, he's like, hey, come hang out with me, and I'll teach you even more. To Madison, okay? Madison was either going to become a pastor, a preacher, or a lawyer, and then somehow he got involved in politics, okay? We give you another name. Alexander Hamilton, okay? I assume you guys seen the Broadway show, Hamilton. Okay, it's based on this book by Ron Chernow. Okay, it's fantastic. Now some of it's pretty dry, but Alexander Hamilton was born in the U.S. Virgin Islands. Okay, he was a bastard child. Okay, so he had no father. His father was Scottish, impregnated his mother, and then disappeared. Hamilton was literally a genius. If you talk about taking the ACT, okay, this is the type of guy that's going to ace it. Okay, brilliant. Okay, at a young age, he went to work in the Virgin Islands for a guy that ran a shipping company, like an international shipping company. At the age of 13, this shipping magnate wanted to go to Europe, which would take him, several months to go to Europe, spend some time there, and come back. He left the 13-year-old Alexander Hamilton in charge of a shipping company. When he got back, things were still running smoothly, if not better. And so this guy and some others in the Virgin Islands sponsored Alexander Hamilton to come to the States to go to William and Mary. Actually, he was going to go to Harvard to become a lawyer. When he showed up at Harvard, they said, hey, you're going to have to take all these classes, and it's going to take you 4 years, and so forth. And he's like, no, I don't have that kind of time. So he went to William and Mary, and they said, well, maybe we can work out something different. And he said, just give me the books. Give me the books. 6 months later, he came back and passed the bar exam. Okay. Then when the revolution broke out, he read some books on artillery and joined the Continental and was just, in charge of artillery and just, had some really good fights against the British. And guess who took notice of it? George Washington took notice of this young Alexander Hamilton. So George Washington makes Hamilton his aide-de-camp. So Washington Alexander becomes Washington's protege. Okay, so these two men are going to be very important when writing the new Constitution. Jefferson is in France. He is the U.S. Minister to France. So Jefferson left, went to France, and he took his slave with him. One of his slaves. You guys know this story? Sally Hemings. Now, Sally Hemings was the house slave. She was, some would say, mighty near white, because she was born from Jefferson's, they think, uncle had slept with the slave, and Sally Hemings was born. So she was half white, half black, okay, but her skin was very light. By this time, Jefferson's wife had passed away, okay. You ever hear this thing, Virginia is for lovers? Never, have somebody seen that? There's bumper stickers. And that comes from Jefferson. Jefferson was madly in love with his wife, okay? And when she died, he was devastated. So when Jefferson was president, it was actually his daughter that served as first lady, okay? But while he was in France, he took Sally Hemings, one of his slaves, and his daughter, and from his marriage. And it is well documented that Jefferson and Sally Hemings bore at least one child, if not two children, okay, while in France. Okay. Now, Sally was able to stay in France. She never came back because she didn't want to live in bondage again, Now, you can trace the DNA of the Hemings clan with the Jefferson clan. Okay, so there is a clan of African Americans, descendants of Thomas Jefferson, which is pretty interesting. Okay, so he was kind of sleeping with a cousin because she was. Now, some people thought it was his father that had slept with Sally Hemings' mother, slave, but others think it's the uncle. So he wasn't sleeping with his sister. Or so we think.
It's definitely incest.
Yes. Yeah. Guys, obviously it wasn't uncommon for that type of thing to take place with slaves, okay? And I'm sure most of the time it was against their will. So, all right. So, Washington is saying, look, we need to do something. Hamilton and Madison are actually going to meet in Annapolis, Maryland, before this convention in May of 1787. In Annapolis, they start to draw up some ideas. It's really what they want to do is change the Constitution, the Articles of Confederation. In the beginning, they're like, we just need to fix it because it had no power for the national government. It's at Annapolis where Hamilton and Madison meet, and they decide to just scrap the Articles of Confederation and start over. Okay? So they plan for a constitutional convention where Philadelphia again, okay, Independence Hall, okay, from May to September 1787, okay. There's going to be 55 delegates. Guys, this is the hottest summer in 30 years. It's hot in there. There's no air conditioning. Open the windows, the flies come in. Close the windows, you have no. Okay. Now, these 55 men, 8 of them had signed the Declaration of Independence, 7 had attended the First Continental Congress, and 7 of them were governors of their states. This is an important group of men, and they're going to be gone for 3 months, so the governor's taking off for 3 months to work on this. All right? This is a big deal. All right? So they are going to give you some, I put some of these up here. Notables that are there. Ben Franklin, still alive, by the way. He's like 78 now. Life expectancy is about 46. Franklin lived a very long life. He's such an interesting guy to study. He liked to go to France as well. He was loved in France, and he loved the French ladies. Franklin was a player. Okay, he was, he was married, but then his wife died because life expectancy. He long outlived his wife, and so he was a free man. A dirty old man. Of course, Washington, he's like a god. I mean, think about what Washington had accomplished, defeating the British, the best army in the world, okay? So when he walks in the room, it's like, that's George Washington. That's George Washington. So when Washington is actually going to become the president of the Constitutional Convention, okay? Hamilton, of course, I mentioned. And then the next one is Madison, I have on there. He's going to become known as the father of the Constitution. Okay? Madison comes with a plan. Now, Jefferson is in France, right? So Jefferson doesn't really have anything to do with the Constitution. Okay? Elizabeth, do you remember in your terms, did they have Shays Rebellion? Okay. So check, I mean, that was during this, okay. Patrick Henry of Virginia. Now, we haven't really talked about him yet. Henry, when they were trying to declare independence, okay, if Virginia went for independence, then South Carolina, North Carolina, and Georgia would probably follow. Because Virginia is the most powerful state. Patrick Henry gave a speech before the Virginia Convention, and he said these famous words, right? Give me liberty or give me death, right? It was that speech that convinced Virginia to declare independence. Remember, they needed all 13 to say we're going to go for independence. Henry is really credited with that, okay? Patrick Henry doesn't like the idea of a strong national government. So he is opposed to this whole constitutional convention. He's worried about strong national government that's going to abuse the people, okay? To be honest, that's what I worry about today. I worry about certain people getting into office and really trying to transform our government into something that it was never meant to be. That scares me as a citizen of this country. I'm worried about that. Patrick Henry was worried about that. And he's going to bring up some very good points of why this could become dangerous, this new Constitution. Now, guys, it's the oldest Constitution in the world. Every other country in the world in the last 220 years has rewritten their Constitution, while ours has endured. The oldest in the world, and we are one of the youngest countries in the world, which says something about this document. Okay? So as we get into the document more, we're going to learn about the plans that went into this and why we call Madison the father of the Constitution. Okay? So you got to tune in tomorrow to keep this rolling. Okay? And you won't hurt my feelings if you get up at 8 o'clock in the morning and watch live.